Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to today's Policy Forum with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. My name is Dana Stroul. I'm the Research Director here at the Washington Institute, and I'm pleased to be joined by some of our best experts on Iran and the U.S. Iran policy set here today for this really important and timely discussion. Let me just say that by tomorrow's signing ceremony of the U.S. Iran Memorandum of Understanding in Switzerland, this MOU will have been signed no less than 3 times, signaling just how important it is to the Trump administration. With yesterday's public release of the text of the MOU, we can now move from speculation and analyzing leaks to actual analysis, which is what makes today's discussion so timely. Reactions to this MOU cover the entire spectrum, from it being a necessary path for economic stabilization, freedom of navigation, and an off-ramp to more war, to the potential for a transformational agreement for the entire Middle East, all the way to U.S. surrender and capitulation. We've seen leaders in Tehran and Washington message completely divergent narratives about the benefits of this deal and what the MOU will deliver. To discuss all of these issues, we have pulled together, as I said, some of our top experts here at the Washington Institute. I'm pleased to be joined here in the room by Holly Dagres, the Libitsky Family Senior Fellow and a leading voice on Iranian social movements, generational change, and she is also the curator of the Iranist newsletter. If you are not a subscriber, I encourage you to do so. Joining us virtually, Richard Nephew, who is the Bernstein Adjunct Fellow and a former U.S. Deputy Special Envoy for Iran. And finally, joining us from Israel, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who is the Washington Institute's counselor and the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow. In addition to his government service across many administrations, Dennis most recently served as an advisor on Iran policy during the Obama administration. With introductions out of the way, let's dive right into it. We have enough to discuss that could take the entire afternoon, and we are going to keep this to one tight hour. I want to start by giving each of you an opportunity to lay out your thoughts and your analysis about the MOU now that you've had less than 24 hours to read the actual U.S. official text. Richard, I'd like to start with you, and then we'll move to Dennis and finally to Holly in the room. Richard, go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much, Dana. It's always good to join great colleagues like you. I think if you boil down the MOU, you really get to a trade of the Strait of Hormuz closure for the blockade, and then some promises about future negotiations, what might potentially come out of them. Some of those promises are quite robust and quite extensive, with a significant amount of sanctions relief to help lock in both the memorandum and then presumably to keep Iran in compliance with it. That's how I basically see this going down. On the nuclear pieces, frankly, there's not a lot here that is different, new, or substantive. There is a commitment that Iran will not change its nuclear program in exchange for a commitment from the United States not to change its sanctions program against Iran. That's the basic trade. And then there's a commitment to address nuclear issues, including the status of the highly enriched uranium in a future deal. Now, there is language there that speaks to, at a minimum, this would include dilution, potentially could include export or something similar. So this would effectively make the HEU no longer an issue, but it's critical to say that is not presently the case. And there's also omissions there in terms of verification and how that would work, not just with respect to the HEU, where there is a mention of the International Atomic Energy Agency, but across the nuclear program. So those things are concerning to me, especially when you offset it against the significance of the sanctions relief. And really, I know a lot of folks have paid attention to this $300 billion reconstruction fund. I'm sure we'll get into it. I'm actually less focused on that, in part because that would only come as part of a final deal, and it's a little sketchy. I'm more focused on the two elements of sanctions relief that are in here, which is essentially unfettering Iran's ability to export oil and to be able to gain the revenues from it, as well as access to all of its restricted funds that are potentially located around the world. A number that could potentially go from 24 billion to even I've seen estimates up to 100 billion. It's a lot of money that the Iranians will gain access to quite quickly. And while there are still significant U.S. sanctions that will remain in place, this is an infusion of cash that I think will be useful to the Iranian government as both they deal with the challenges of the aftermath of the conflict, and then as they think about what they may choose to do with that money, whether it's rearming and supporting their proxy groups, rebuilding their missile force, or doing other such of activities. I think the biggest question that I've got outstanding is what really happens at the end of 60 days? And then I'll pass the mic. I think the expectation that is in the paragraph that talks about the timeline, you could read both ways. It says that the United States and Iran commit to negotiate and achieve the final deal in a maximum of 60 days, comma, extendable by mutual consent. And I look at that and basically see a prudent, reasonable, sensible thing for negotiators to build themselves space and time to continue with the talks, but also a pretty significant risk that this is the deal. This is the last deal, that this deal is just extended ad infinitum because the reserve price, what you would have to pay if you wanted to exit the deal is significant. For the United States, it would have to be kind of de facto a willingness to re-enter the conflict and restart the war. The same for the Iranians, with all the consequences that potentially could come with that. And I just find that fairly unlikely if we hit that kind of deadline in 60 days. So I think there are a lot of questions that I've got about other bits of the text, lots of questions about conformity with U.S. law and how this will work, but that's at least my initial reaction as I started looking at this.
Thanks so much, Richard. Dennis, over to you.
Well, first, let me say, good to be with all of you, even if I'm from a distance. I very much share what Richard described. I have a very similar view. There are really three things I think I focus on in terms of my concerns, just in terms of the substance of the MOU. Even though what Richard said is right, that the substance is quite general and most things are left to being negotiated, but even what I see there raises a few concerns. One, the reference to the enriched uranium. To be fair to them, in the MOU, it doesn't say highly enriched uranium, just refers to the enriched uranium. So that's actually good. But it then talks about the downblending or dilution as being the only thing they're explicit on. I listened to the vice president talk about they've committed to destruction. There's nothing in the MOU that says they've been committed to destruction. On the contrary, dilution or downblending, that's good because you can reduce it from highly enriched uranium to something less. But unfortunately, you can reverse that process and you can produce highly enriched uranium out of it. So that seems to me you have a baseline there that, at least as the MOU is explaining things, doesn't reassure me. The second thing that worries me is the discussion on the Strait of Hormuz. It's true, as Richard said, this is basically a deal to open the Strait of Hormuz, and everything else is kind of to be determined later on. But even here, there is a nod to the Iranian position that they get to manage it after the fact, because you have, for 60 days, there's no tolls. But then it says after that, the Iranians will engage in discussions with Oman and then with the other Gulf states on maritime services, meaning they're setting the stage to allow the Iranians to impose fees. This is a terrible precedent from the standpoint of thinking about international choke points, where countries who border those choke points can decide we can gain something politically and economically from it. So I'm worried about that language there. And now I'm going to lead to the fact what worries me more than what I've just said. I think the linkage of Hormuz to Lebanon is a strategic mistake. Iran isn't linking Lebanon to this deal because they want to save Lebanon. They're linking Lebanon to this deal because they want to save Hezbollah. And the last thing we should be party to is somehow making it easier for them to make that a condition. And yet they have made it a condition. So I think that is something, if you ask me, if the Iranian leadership really knew that this was a deal breaker for President Trump, somehow I don't believe that they would put what's in their interest at stake for Hezbollah. But it's clear that they imposed that condition. We haven't imposed a reverse one. And I'm hoping in the context of the negotiations, we'll see an approach that takes advantage of the fact that we do have leverage. I'll conclude with this, and it also is related to something Richard said about the whole issue of leverage. I would be more confident in leverage if the president hadn't talked about the collapse of the world economy in a way that he described as being equivalent to the 1929 collapse economically, which clearly he was using to justify why we needed to open the straits and why we needed to end the conflict. If that remains uppermost in his mind, it's hard to believe that the Iranians will take seriously the threats he makes that he would bomb if they're not prepared to go ahead and live up to this the way it is. It feels more like this deal to open the straits is sort of the extent of it, notwithstanding everything that's being said, but obviously in time, we'll see what happens in these 60 days.
Thanks so much, Dennis. Holly.
Well, first, I should say it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with two people that have spent a lot of time on negotiations, whether it's peace in the Middle East or on Iran's nuclear program. I think there's a couple of things I want to touch on that haven't been discussed. First is the optics of this memorandum of understanding. I think it's noteworthy that the Iranians signed onto it after the day after Tehran time, so technically it was no longer on President Trump's birthday. So that was not really talked about. Second, President Donald Trump signed this deal in Versailles, which the Iranians very much took note of its symbolism, and they saw this as basically Tehran being the victor in this, and that basically the United States were Germany after World War I, in their eyes, of course. And some of this commentary also played out. I just saw that Supreme Leader Moshtaba Khamenei said that, quote, "It was the American president who, out of desperation, used all kind of leverage," unquote, to make this deal happen. And then there was this extraordinary photo of President Masoud Pezeshkian with President Trump's Sharpie signature. And he's holding this picture. And when you think about it, this is the same president that is the face of maximum pressure that killed IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in his first administration, and of course had a role in the killing of the supreme leader during this war. And so I think those are really noteworthy. That being said, not everyone in Tehran, of course, is on board. The same kind of discussions that are playing out here in the United States between the Democrats and Republicans right now are also playing out in Tehran to an extent. Of course, the hardliner principle, as they're known in Persian, are actually one of the biggest critics of this deal. Notably, some might remember when the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal happened under the first Trump administration in 2018. They famously had a copy of the JCPOA, and they lit it on fire in Parliament and chanted "Death to America" and "Death to Israel," and said this is exactly why you shouldn't trust the United States. And so some of that commentary is playing out right now in Tehran, that they should not be trusting the United States on this tax, and that some are even saying that they conceded too much, including their leverage on the Strait of Hormuz. And interestingly, there's some commentary that's saying that actually the MOU should be ratified by Tehran's Majlis or parliament. And then I found, again, just on the commentary of The View from Tehran, even a reformist journalist said, I want to read this because it's really interesting. He said, "They had come to take our oil, carve up our land, and appoint a governor for each piece of it. But through the bravery of Iran's sons, the United States suffered such a defeat that they were forced to accept Iran's sovereignty over Hormuz and return Lebanon as though it were Iran's possession. We have not experienced such a victory in foreign war since the time of Nader Shah." And just for a little background on Nader Shah, he's probably one of the most famous kings in Iranian history that actually expanded the Persian Empire through vast military conquests. But the interesting bit, or the irony, is that down the line he was assassinated and his empire fell. And so I think the last point I want to emphasize is that there is no conversation about the Iranian people. Arguably, one would say that sanctions relief is for the Iranian people, but we can debate maybe what that money would look like and even if it would reach the Iranian people. But just the loosening on the economy is relevant nevertheless. But this is a president that said help is on the way and had promised regime change, but now there's not even a conversation about human rights. And then just looking at the MOU, just purely, if you look at the text, one can conclude that this war was futile because, you know, a lot of this could have just been discussed through diplomacy, and the Strait of Hormuz has historically always been open. So I see this MOU as just kicking the can down the road, not conceding to Tehran, but that's certainly how voices in Iran are seeing this right now.
Thanks, Holly. So Holly makes a good point about diplomacy and the narrative that this represents an achievement of diplomacy, which we've actually seen from Washington, D.C. And then you make, I think, a very important point about the diversity actually of views within Iran about the merits of the MOU. There have been, of course, comparisons here in Washington, D.C. to the 2015 Iran nuclear agreements. And I wanted to just give everybody an opportunity, if you wanted to share any thoughts on whether or not there is something to compare how you look at the time period a little more than a decade ago versus the agreements that were struck today. Dennis, let's start with you and then Richard.
Okay, so well, I do think it's kind of apples and oranges because you had a negotiation with the Iranians. There wasn't a war in advance. That negotiation produced a 15-year agreement on the character of its program. Not there was another 10 years as it related to monitoring and verification, but for 15 years, the Iranians were limited to 3.67% as the level of enrichment. They had to ship out 98% of the enriched uranium they had. There was no highly enriched uranium at that time, but they had to ship out 98% of the enriched uranium they have. And by the way, that wasn't discussion of dilution. It was just they had to ship it out, and it was they could retain within the country less than one bomb's worth of material. So on the one hand, the MOU is not about permitting enrichment anytime soon, although the discussion of a moratorium that we'd heard previously is nowhere to be found in the MOU. So that's one of the things, much like Richard, there'll be things I'll be looking for in what begins to emerge. But there is supposedly going to be some extended period where there is no enrichment. All right, so that's better than the JCPOA. On the other hand, the JCPOA, when it came to the lifting of sanctions, it was focused only on lifting the nuclear-related sanctions. There were no lifting of sanctions for human rights, no lifting of sanctions for terror. In a sense, the basic posture of the administration was on those kinds of issues, Iran will still be held accountable. And we will not be lifting that. So that here, there's actually a discussion of lifting of all primary and all secondary sanctions without any reference. There's no distinction whatsoever between these different classes of sanctions. So on the one hand, yes, this is an improvement from the standpoint there'll be no enrichment for some period of time. On the other hand, we don't know if there's actually going to be a ship out of material. And Richard made a reference to this a little earlier when he's speaking, I'm unsettled by the fact that we seem to be giving up on the idea of human rights sanctions against a regime that we know literally massacred probably 35,000 people in January. I think it's important for the United States to continue to stand for something. Human rights is very much a part of who we are. To be dismissive of it, to simply remove it, strikes me as being something that I would like to see reversed in the context of this being pursued. And I do expect that there will be, and Dana, you would know more about this than anyone, there has to be a review of this on the Hill. And it would be hard for me to believe that in that review on the Hill, issues like the ones I just mentioned, particularly on human rights, will not be raised.
Well, don't worry. I was going to ask about the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act next, and for your view on whether or not the MOU text as we understand it today triggers it. But before that, Richard, since you were handed the ball for implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action years ago, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how what we have in this MOU compares to 2015.
Yeah, I would fundamentally agree with Dennis. I don't think that there is really much of a comparison just because the scope is so much different, the requirements are so much different, the intended sanctions relief is profoundly different. So I generally agree. I would say a more reasonable apples to apples comparison might be the Joint Plan of Action, which not many of us talk a lot about, but that was that original deal that we cut in November of 2013 after months of secret talks and attempting to work through some of these issues. And even there, I think that the most fundamental comparison you make is it's a deal to provide space for negotiations, and I think that's a reasonable thing to try and do. I don't have any reason to oppose that kind of thing. But even there, frankly, the JPOA did a lot more and offered a lot less. So I'll just read a couple of lines here briefly. The first paragraph of the Iran would undertake following measures line includes that Iran will dilute the remaining 20% after a working stockpile had been set aside. So unlike in this MOU, where there's a promise to in the future do potentially dilution or downblending, this is something that was part of the JPOA. This was part of the deal that the Iranians are supposed to do already. In the JPOA, it's only 4 pages long. A third of a page is all the different IEA inspection accesses and requirements that are supposed to be there to help give the IEA the ability to implement both this deal and future deals. There's almost no mention at all of the IEA in this MOU. When you get to the sanctions relief part, in the MOU, we are actively encouraging and will facilitate Iran's ability to expand its oil sales. In the JPOA, the very first line of the sanctions relief is we'll pause efforts to further reduce their oil sales. So we agreed to hold firm on the sales that they had already, that we had already stopped, but we were going to allow them to continue to sell oil at that level. We were willing to allow them to get a set amount of the revenues that they were going to make from those sales, not open-ended, which you have in this MOU. So, when I look across the JPOA, which is the apples to apples, let's build space for negotiations, I see in the MOU far more concessional steps being taken on sanctions relief with far less actually happening with regard to the nuclear step. And so I don't think that this remotely compares to the JPOA in addition to not comparing to the JCPOA.
And just to follow up on Richard's point, I mean, also it's this is actually ironically even a shorter text. I think the JPOA was 2.5 pages longer. But the one thing I found interesting from the commentary after the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding was actually the Iranian foreign minister spokesman who noted that any Israeli military operations in Lebanon would constitute a breach of the MOU. And so I wondered, would they actually consider striking Israel again, like they did in the tit for tat strikes that we saw the other week? And so I'm operating under the impression that they seem to maybe have the potential of overplaying their card and acting out on that because they're so. I think they really think that there is this desperation to bring things back to the status quo with the world economy. And arguably, I mean, given that some of the dynamics that are publicly playing out, they probably are hoping another strike that would maybe drive a wedge between Israel and the United States as well, potentially.
Thanks, Holly. I'd like to move forward in this conversation now because the title of this webinar is, of course, Post-War Regional Order, ? So let me read you all a few quotes of reactions. Dennis mentioned the coming debates in Congress. And so I'm going to read 2 different quotes from members of the Senate. The first, the expansion of the Abraham Accords and normalizing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel is the ultimate goal. The signing of the MOU is an essential step to make that happen, and it is worthwhile. Compare this. So this quote that this MOU is the beginning of ushering in a transformational, a hinge moment in the Middle East. Then this one, Reagan is rolling over in his grave. Iran's nuclear ambitions were not curbed, and they have not learned that threatening the Strait of they have learned that threatening the Strait of Hormuz works and will undoubtedly leverage it in the future. Now, Iran gets to build brand new infrastructure under this deal. Before the war, the strait was open, Iran was being crushed by sanctions, and 13 service members were still alive. Now, 13 Americans are dead, families have paid billions at the pump, sanctions will be lifted, and the bombing has stopped. This is the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. Very diverse views showing such a sharp divide. These are from Republican members of the Senate, so very wide spectrum of reactions. Holly, before we go to American reactions, I'm wondering if you have shared some of the quotes coming out of the Iranian regime, but I'm interested in looking forward now. We've heard either this is a foreign policy blunder by the United States or this is ushering in more inclusion, integration, and expansion of the Abraham Accords. For Iran, especially the new regime leaders, what is your assessment of how they view this MOU and what kind of new phase for Iran and the region is this ushering in? And then I'd also invite you to share a little bit about the Iranian people and how they view the future of Iran in the Middle East as a result of this MOU.
Sure. Well, I think, a lot of this, I don't see the Iranians trying to rock the regional boat order at this juncture, separate from the comment I made earlier about the potential of an attack on Israel in the event of military operations in Lebanon. And I think that much of their focus is going to be on inward. They've got a lot going on. They've got the funeral of the supreme leader, actually, that interestingly starts on July 4th. So I wonder what kind of message they're sending there and lasts till July 9th. I think the country is going to be really very much in rebuild mode. They've obviously been through a lot infrastructurally, but also they're going to be building up their offensive and defensive capabilities because there's this real distrust of the United States and Israel that this war could end up in a part 3 iteration. And so I think there's going to be a lot of focus on that. I found it interesting that the speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who was one of the leading faces of these talks, had said in a meeting with private sector reps that there needs to be a shift towards economic recovery after the war. And he also honed in on China, which is one of Tehran's top oil buyers. And so I think they're really recognizing that, this is, they really need to start rebuilding quick, whether it's the economy, whether it's not from a military standpoint, but also, there's a lot of conversation here from like President Donald Trump that there's been regime change, that the repression's not so bad anymore. I think he was saying the other day, not verbatim, but along those lines. But I think it's important to emphasize that executions continue to skyrocket. We haven't seen numbers like this since the 1980s. There were 2 protesters just the other day related to the January anti-regime uprising that were executed. There was a singer just yesterday and her 8 crew members that were sentenced to 74 lashes for purely putting up a video of her singing without mandatory hijab. And that was something that had been posted in 2024. So they've got the memory of an elephant. They're going back in history, basically looking at people that they can go after to send a message into the public. And that's really because there's still very much a looming threat from its own people who are still overwhelmingly anti-regime and whose lives have been significantly worsened from an economic standpoint because of this war and are still traumatized by this unprecedented massacre of Iranian protesters in January. There was a survey that was just released by the Interior Ministry that found that 60% of Iranians have no hope for an improvement in future conditions. So I think the one thing I would emphasize is that, it's hard to predict where this country is going to go from here, but Iranian history shows that there's a lot of surprises, there's a lot of twists and turns. And while this is a regime that's run by a younger Khamenei, it's still more hardline, more emboldened. But at the end of the day, as long as these systemic issues of mismanagement, corruption, and repression are not addressed by the clerical establishment, I think that any economic benefit tied to the MOU, be it sanctions relief or otherwise, or merely the lifting of the blockade is just a Band-Aid on these wider issues that they're unable to take care of.
Okay, Dennis, so Holly predicts a focus by the Iranian regime inward in the coming weeks and months, and a worsening situation for the Iranian people because the regime fundamentally does not change its behavior or the way in which it governs, and it also will be unable to deliver meaningful change for the Iranian people. For you, Dennis, can we move to Israel in the post-war regional order? We have members of Congress saying that the ultimate goal is normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and that this MOU is an essential step in realizing that objective. What's your view on the potential reshaping of the region in light of this MOU?
I don't think that the MOU is seen by the Saudis as something that gives them an additional incentive to move towards political normalization with Israel. I think they may move towards some understandings with the Iranians, particularly because the Iranians now have a leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. Some of what's being talked about in terms of this $300 billion fund, the vice president was talking about, the Gulf states would be investing in Iran. And I think I don't believe you're going to see a rush of Gulf money to the Iranians, because I think they'll use this from their standpoint as a lever on Iran. Just to comment briefly on something that Holly was saying, I have this view that whatever money comes in, the more you give, you create an economic lifeline, the more you buy this regime time. But this regime, in the aftermath of the war, is going to have to make some basic choices. It's clear their preference is to rebuild their defense industrial base, to rebuild the inventory of missiles and cruise missiles and drones that have been destroyed. But how do they reconcile that with an economy that's largely collapsed? How do they reconcile that with huge unemployment? How do they reconcile that with the fact that they can't deliver water and they can't deliver electricity and they don't have a currency that has any value? The public's alienation from the regime isn't going to be less, even as the regime is acting the way that Holly was saying, was to crack down as a way of trying to preempt further demonstration. They're trying to create so much coercion so quickly, with the cost being high, that the public will basically retreat in the face of that or stay quiescent. But if there comes a point where, if life is really bad and you have nothing to lose, your attitudes begin to change. I don't think it happens right away, but I think it does happen increasingly in the course of a year. Now, why do I say that in answer to your question? I say it because the Saudis and the Emiratis and others will look at this and they will see it gives them a potential lever to offer the regime something, but they'll require something from it in return. Now, one of the things the Iranians in return will sort of insist on, it certainly with the Saudis and others, is no normalization with Israel. And I don't think it's a high enough priority for the Saudis, especially given the mood in their public, especially the younger public, towards Israel because of the image of destruction, death and destruction in Gaza. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we may not see, given the interest in building an infrastructure to get around the Strait of Hormuz and maybe the Bab el-Mandeb, that we could well see movement on the India-Middle East economic corridor to Europe, which is building an infrastructure that would allow you to bypass not only the Straits of Hormuz, but also the Bab el-Mandeb. Now, the Saudis may be doing this more initially focused on Syria, but the Emiratis will be focused very heavily on Israel. If anything, in terms of the region, the Emiratis have drawn closer to the Israelis. And I would just say collectively, and this is something that you follow closer than anybody, so I would be careful how much I say about it, there is no question that there were holes in their defense as they saw it. And while this will be good for Ukraine, because Ukraine is giving them answers that are really quite cost effective against drones. But they also know that those holes in early warning and in missile defense, those can be closed, even if all the munitions can't, with greater integration regionally on those in the military area. Now, you don't have to broadcast that. That's the beauty of Central Command. You don't have to broadcast it. I don't think these states want to broadcast that they're drawing closer to Israel. I do think that they realize that there are areas where they need to integrate more because it serves their interests. And I do think the economic side related to IMEC and building alternative infrastructure does create opportunities as long as we understand we shouldn't have high expectations. You're seeing an expansion of the Abraham Accords anytime soon.
Thanks, Dennis. Richard, so far between Holly and Dennis discussing what a post-war regional order looks like, we've talked about some of the stakeholders here. The two signatories to the MOU, the United States and Iran. There's also Israel. There's the Gulf states. Then there are non-state actors. One could infer from paragraph 1 of this MOU, the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran and their allies in the current war. Allies probably not in the sense that U.S. law would define allies here. So I'm interested in your assessment of the incentive structure here in the MOU, the incentives of the various players, state actors, non-state actors. Who is incentivized to stick with it in the next 60 days or beyond? Who is incentivized to challenge it? And how does that get managed in your view?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this, as I'm sure all of us have too. In terms of the folks who are incentivized to stick within it, assuming that what's here is what stays here, I think the Iranians are pretty well incentivized. They've got considerable economic benefit to achieve as a result of this. I think they are still incentivized to do a further deal if they can, because they, of course, they're going to find that it's very difficult to continue operating, internationally with all the other sanctions that remain in place. And they're going to find the RGC sanctions, for instance, are going to be making life difficult for them. The banking sanctions will be too. So I don't think they're incentivized to break this deal. I don't think they're also incentivized to just stick with this deal if there is a possibility of getting a more comprehensive one that doesn't require too many concessions. And I think that's where their math runs. They'll want to keep the deal going. They won't necessarily be desperate for a follow-on deal. I actually think that's one of the main conclusions I reach on this, that they'll be happy to stick with this if they have to, but they would, of course, like to get something that is more in terms of sanctions relief if they can. I think the United States is to some degree incentivized to stick within this, or at a minimum, I think the president is, because of all the words that Dennis was pointing to earlier that I would not have advised to have made about the consequences of restarting conflict and so forth. That's not because I think that this war was effectively run or properly strategized. I've got lots of concerns and views about that, or that I think it's a bad idea to have concluded this with some kind of arrangement. In fact, I wrote about this some months ago, that it was important that we find a way to resolve the Strait issue and that coming to some kind of ceasefire was going to be necessary. But I do think that the terms of what are here are potentially quite prejudicial long term, especially if this allows the Iranians to regain advantages they might otherwise have in terms of military rearmament, if we see repression of the Iranian people, if we see those sorts of steps. And then, of course, certainly if we see support to proxies that are going unimpeded, with a sense that the United States is unwilling to act. And I think it's just notable to me that, President Obama repeatedly said during the JCPOA negotiation phase that if this failed, he would go back to military conflict. President Trump has said the same. But I think at this point it would be hard to believe the president, the current president, if he makes that statement, just simply given all of the words he's used about wanting to not go back to conflict. So that leads us to the disincentivizers. Look, I think the Israeli government's got real concerns with what's going to come. I think we've talked about that to some extent, especially if Iranian missile developments continue apace, they continue to expand their drones and those sorts of things. So I think that there is a significant disincentive, notwithstanding the fact that there would, of course, be real problems if they tried to break the deal in the context of the president being as firmly in favor as it is. So I think there may be a disincentive, but not necessarily prepared to act. The one that is a big question mark for me is really Hezbollah, and what Hezbollah's thinking is on this. And obviously, we've got colleagues at the Institute who spend a lot of time trying to get inside that head and to try and think through that. But as I sit here and think about it, they might have real concerns with this, especially the lack of freedom of action, especially if there's a disinclination to respond to Israeli targeting of Hezbollah operations in southern Lebanon and so forth. But I do think the Iranians may be able to persuade Hezbollah to stand firm if they think that they are going to be better off through all this. And this goes to this question of what happens to these resources that are going to Iran as a result of this MOU. Are we going to be able to identify the support that's going to Hezbollah as a result of this? This has always been a concern. It's always been a problem with any kind of negotiated agreement, but it remains like that here too. And it's just worth noting that in this context, the MOU does not solve for that problem, notwithstanding the language that's in number one. And so all this adds up to, I think there's going to be, again, a lot of incentive to stick within this MOU, even if people might want something more, but there's going to be a strong disincentive to exit from it, which is part of the reason why it's my hypothesis, could be wrong, that this is the last agreement and that we'll just have negotiations ad infinitum on a longer term one that no one will really want to risk those kinds of concessions to get into. Instead, people will be more prepared to stick with this.
Thanks, Richard. So you and Dennis and Holly have all provided recommendations to U.S. policymakers or actually been at the decision-making table. And I want to talk about if Richard is wrong and this isn't the final agreement between the United States and Iran, and there actually is momentum or a way to get beyond these 60 days to something more sustainable. Generally, U.S. policymakers want leverage, both incentives and coercive tools. The coercive tools can be both military force, the threat of credible military force, and sanctions. And incentives can be diplomacy, other kinds of engagement, assistance for reconstruction, or the lifting of sanctions. Dennis, I'd like to start with you. And again, I'm going to read just a few sentences from the MOU, which is that by Iran and the United States signing this MOU, they declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon, and undertake from now on not to initiate any war or any military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against each other. And then it goes on to talk about territory and sovereignty in Lebanon. But permanent termination of military operations and refrain from the threat or the use of force strikes me as making it very complicated for the U.S. military to maintain the credible threat of military force. And so I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on how or what your best advice would be to the U.S. negotiating team going forward, given this language.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. Number one, I mean, look, the president's already said if they don't live up to it, we're going to bomb them. So notwithstanding the language you just read, he's still making that threat. Now, because that was a threat that followed a kind of repetition throughout this process, it might not count for much, but at least that's out there. The second thing I would do, I know we can't maintain the same kind of military presence that we have out there, but I would like to see a minimal reduction. I mean, obviously, we have aircraft carriers. We can't keep 2 aircraft carriers there right now, but I'd like to see a minimal reduction of the overall capability beyond the 60 days, because I think that remains. If the president's going to say, we might be prepared, if I don't see that they're doing what needs to be done, I'm prepared to use force. It can't look like we've been withdrawing force to the point where that threat looks like it's more rhetorical than real. The third thing I think that I again would be focused on, and here, what the administration seems to be most comfortable with is offering inducements. There seems to be an assumption. And there was actually one of the backgrounders that was given by one of the officials who was involved in the negotiation, basically said, look, if they want to join the 21st century as an economy, and we think they do, then we're creating the ability for them to do so. And on this one, I'm sure Holly can reinforce what I'm about to say, but that's not what motivates, that's what drives at least the current leadership. By the way, my own view is it's possible at some point it could, but we're not close to anything like that. I've often said that one of the fears that Ali Khamenei had, was the fear that an Iranian Gorbachev would emerge. And if things get bad enough on the inside, you can see someone from within the elite, not necessarily the IRGC, but someone from within the elite, begins to mobilize some support on that basis. So is that going to happen anytime soon? No, I don't think so. But this gets back to, as you said correctly, there's a duality. Coercion is a function sometimes of negative pressure, and sometimes it's a function of inducement. With the Iranians, you have to do both. I've never seen any example historically where offering them incentives got them to change their behavior. I have seen them respond to pressure, and I have seen them use the inducements as a rationalization after the fact. But without the coercive side of this, meaning the negative side of it, they're very unlikely to be responsive.
Richard, I'm going to read to you from paragraph 7, which is that the United States of America undertakes to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, including Security Council resolutions, IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, and all unilateral U.S. sanctions, primary and secondary, in an agreed upon schedule as part of the final deal. So here, building on what Dennis said, that inducements on their own don't work, you need to have pressure. In this case, can the prospect of relief from the primary and the secondary sanctions together, which did deliver crushing economic pressure on Iran, could that be enough of an incentive to persuade the Iranians to make serious concessions on their nuclear program?
It certainly could. And look, I think that's the bet that the administration is making by putting that down here, right? I mean, I think their theory is that the Iranian government will be motivated by a monetary value and the ability to reform the institutions and to build up the system and repair the damage that's done. I mean, we've all been talking about that as a question mark. And I think the administration's position by writing that down is to say the answer to that is yes. So to my mind, I think it's reasonable to be a little bit skeptical about that. I think the Iranians have in the past, when offered significant sanctions relief, have been willing to walk away from the table if it required nuclear concessions that they thought went beyond what was available from their perspective. They wanted to retain uranium enrichment, for instance. They wanted to retain the ability to have R&D facilities that look at new centrifuges, things like that. They've been prepared to walk away before for sanctions relief, being insufficient. On the other hand, this is it. We are literally pushing all the chips into the middle of the table, and I think the bet that's being made is that would be more of an inducement here. I am reasonably skeptical of that. I'm also reasonably skeptical that the Iranians trust the United States will fulfill the terms. And this is where one thing I do want to jump on top of what Dennis said, which I agree with, but I think it's worth pointing out that the Iranians, part of the reason why they may disbelieve some inducements is they think that we just simply won't deliver. And one of the concerns that we faced in 21, when we were trying to renegotiate our ability to enter in the JCPOA and re-enter the deal under President Biden, was the Iranians said, we just don't trust you. We don't think you're going to fulfill these terms. We think you're going to cheat on us again. We think that that President Trump will be reelected and that he'll exit the JCPOA again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if you're going to make this strategy work, and I offer this as advice, as if you want to make this MOU and this approach work, you actually have to make sure that the Iranians do in fact get the benefits they paid for in this MOU, which is quite paradoxical and quite risky. But if you are going to convince the Iranians that this approach is effective, then they need to get the benefits of it, because otherwise it'll reinforce all of their preconceived notions. That comes with tremendous risk, because it means the Iranians are selling a bunch of oil, they're getting the revenues, being able to use it as they potentially wish. But I do think that by buying into this approach, that is what is required. I think the other thing that you have to do is you have to make sure that the United States can bring along parts of the international community with this too. And I think this is an important element we haven't really talked about yet. But this paragraph includes references to the UN Security Council. Well, we're only one permanent member. There are 4 others. There are 2 that might be deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear program. There are 2 that might want to get something out of the United States in exchange for something here. So I think one of the things that we'll need to do to make this work is to demonstrate that we can work with the international community to actually deliver on all of these things, because we can't do it alone. And we especially can't deliver concrete benefits they may be looking for from Europe in terms of economic activity. And the last thing I would just say is I do think if you're going to make any of this stuff work on the coercive side, you do have to demonstrate that you're prepared to have the alternative that may come through offensive military forces being positioned in the region. But I don't think we should neglect the defensive side, because ultimately part of the reason why this conflict generated so much pressure to bring it to an end was the fact that Iranian missiles and drones, even if it was only a small percentage, they were still getting through. And so I do think that's an element that would have to be part of any strategy to prove that you actually mean it when you say there is a or else part of this discussion.
Holly, I don't have anything to read for you with respect to anything the Iranian regime is asked to do with respect to the Iranian people. But there is interesting language in paragraph 2 about the two countries agreeing to respect each other and to refrain from interfering in each other's internal affairs. This could be read as some sort of U.S. commitment to not restore some of the programs that had been in place until the end of 2024 to support civil society, free access to information, these sorts of things. But now I'd like to ask you for your thoughts on anything that the Trump administration can do now to signal that it has not completely abandoned the Iranian people.
Yes, so it's interesting you honed in on that because that language was reminiscent of what we saw in the Algiers Accords. And when I brought this up earlier, this lack of human rights being part of the conversation. What's interesting is that the first Trump administration actually made human rights a top foreign policy agenda, and we've obviously seen that no longer exist. That being said, it's clear that they can talk human rights because guess what? They're doing it in their talks with Cuba and have called on them to release political prisoners. So I think when there's a will, there's a way, and they just haven't been willing to do that in the context of Iran. And there's still obviously room to actually insert human rights as part of these negotiations. There's supposed to be 60 days of it. And so the president could call for a moratorium on executions or the release of prominent political prisoners and whatnot. But there's also things that you noted, Dana, which is that they could turn on funding for human rights organizations that are really integral in this moment in documenting those human rights violations, and also doing research and gathering evidence for those atrocity crimes that were committed in January that could be offered to the UN fact-finding mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is what we saw during the 2022 Women Like Freedom Uprising. There's also internet freedom organizations that they can give funding to. Yes, the internet is back on for now, but guess what? 35% of the world's most popular websites are blocked, and the State Department was funding a good chunk of those circumvention tools like VPNs, and that funding no longer exists. There's also some acts that are in Congress right now. There's the Iran Human Rights, Internet Freedom and Accountability Act and the Internet Reach and Access Now Act, or the Iran Act, that I hope Congress will try to pass soon, and that will be made into law that actually address some of these things. So there's definitely these conversations happening here in Washington. They're just not a real top priority. There's also other things that the United States can do to show that they still care about the Iranian people. They could stop deporting Iranian asylum seekers. We just saw a pro-democracy activists get deported to conflict-ridden Central African Republic. And then right now, as we speak, we have some really bright minds studying at our elite universities like Harvard and MIT that have exercised their right to free speech at anti-regime diaspora protests since January. And they are really scared that their visas won't be renewed. So these are just some examples of how the United States can help the Iranian people. And some of them don't require negotiations. So I think that's a way to prioritize them in some way. Otherwise, you've effectively lost one of the most pro-American populations in the world. And I think that's, and have brought a realization to these anti-regime Iranians that it doesn't matter who's in office, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, the United States does not support the Iranian people in their view.
Thanks so much for that, Holly. Very sobering. We have about 5 minutes left in this conversation, so I want to do just a few rapid fire questions at the end, just to get your takes on a few things. So the first one is, do you all, we're going to go Dennis, Richard, Holly for the first one. Does this MOU set the region on a path to more stability or more instability? Dennis. You're muted.
It depends how you define stability. If stability is defined as not only are things becoming more stable, but there's a possibility of ending conflicts, expanding peacemaking, it's not going to do that. But if stability is a kind of no war, no peace, the risk of war goes down, it doesn't go up, that I think actually will be aided by the MOU, because I don't have high expectations that we'll see a conclusion in 60 days. I think it'll be extended. But I think, and I think Richard was saying this earlier, I think both sides have an interest in sustaining this. Neither side has an interest in resuming the war.
Richard.
Yeah, I would say short-term stability, long-term instability, because this doesn't solve anything. And the question about whether or not there is, in fact, a longer-term deal is much more important to long-term stability questions than the short-term.
I'm going to have to agree with Richard there. I think it is definitely short-term stability, at least for the next 60 days while the World Cup's happening and Americans are traveling with their cars cross country. And so until then, we'll see what happens.
There's a lot of discussion here in the United States about whether this agreement signals American dominance or American capitulation. But as important as views here in Washington about this agreement are views in the region about what this signals about American commitment to the region. So this time we'll again go Dennis, Richard, and then Holly. Does this MOU, is it going to reinforce views of positive American leadership, or does it leave our partners in the region questioning the U.S. role? Dennis.
I think that leaves them more uncertain than they were before. I think they will have real questions about whether or not we're going to stay in the region. It'll be really important not for us to be withdrawing our forward-based presence, even though those bases didn't end up helping deter attacks from the Iranians, and we did evacuate a lot of our personnel off these bases. Still, the bases are a manifestation that the U.S. remains committed to the region. And to be fair to the Trump administration, the MOU is a reminder that if you're going to see any deal done, the U.S. is going to be a central player in it. No one else is going to produce these deals. But yes, the U.S. worked with mediators who had a real incentive to try to prevent this conflict from going on, and they wanted to end it. But it's still the central player in this is the U.S. So I don't think it changes that perception of the U.S., but it does probably change the perception of the reliability of the U.S.
Richard.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, but I guess I think it reinforces the sense of whiplash that folks in the region have and they complain about all the time. And I'm sure we've all had those conversations about U.S. policy going back many years, but this whiplash has intensified over the couple of months. I mean, it wasn't long ago that the President of the United States said unconditional surrender. This is not unconditional surrender by any stretch of the imagination from the Iranians. And so I think the sense that people have is, geez, no matter what you guys do, you're taking us to the left, then you're taking us to the right, then you're taking us to the left. And I think there's just this sense of, if there is stability to be found, it's the U.S. not engaging in some of these things and instead letting people in the region lead. I actually kind of wonder whether or not that's the real trajectory of this, whether or not folks in the region say, yeah, we're happy to have you hang out, but, please, you need to stop doing stuff on your own and let us take leadership. And that actually might be a message that is that matches where the moment is for this administration.
I would say that they're quietly questioning the U.S. role in the region. Not that they would want them to leave, but the fact that the U.S. did start this quagmire, and it was effectively a bunch of countries in the region that really pushed and said that this conflict needs to end and led diplomacy. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. And so I think there's this realization that regional affairs need to be dealt in the region. And unfortunately, that's something the Iranians have been pushing for years. And it started with 2019 after the Aramco attacks. It was actually the government of Hassan Rouhani that pushed for this HOPE initiative, which was the Hormuz peace endeavor, a regional security and cooperation initiative. And so this is kind of like a dream for the Iranians in some ways, that the region is handling regional matters. And so I think that's what they're thinking.
We have 1 minute left. Bonus question. Does the text of the MOU trigger the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, and will it be subject to some sort of congressional vote? Richard first.
Yes, it does, and no, it won't.
Dennis.
I will echo what he said. Yes, it does, and no, it won't.
Ollie.
I will third that.
All right. I want to thank everybody for sticking with us for the full hour. I have certainly been educated by my colleagues here. If you enjoyed and benefited from this really rich dialogue here, please tune in on Monday, June 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are going to be having a policy forum, a public discussion about the Ankara NATO summit hosted by Turkey. While certainly the signing of the MOU is sandwiched by the meeting of the G7 earlier this week, it will then be bookended on the other side by a historic, in the words of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, NATO summit in Ankara. Although many issues related to the transatlantic alliance will be front and center, so many issues related to the Middle East will also be quite present during that dialogue. To learn about both the U.S.-Turkey bilateral relationship, what might happen with respect to the NATO alliance, and the relevance of Middle East crises to the NATO agenda, please tune in on Monday and continue to read the rich body of work that is put out every single day by our senior fellows here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thanks so much.